Well, hello there, watching the press preview. A first look at what is on the front pages. Time to see what's making the headlines with The Guardian's political editor, Pippa Crerar, and the director of the Onward think tank, Sebastian Payne. Welcome to both of you. So, shall we check out the front pages? Let us start with The Guardian. Courtesy of Pippa, the PM faces a revolt on Rwanda plans as senior Tories quit. It follows the resignation of two Conservative Party deputy chairmen over the Rwanda migration policy. The Financial Times says Rishi Sunak has suffered a heavy blow following tonight's resignations. The Daily Express has a similar story, reporting on the PM's last-ditch plea. Two rebels come together on the Rwanda plan. The Telegraph also leading on the Rwanda rebels, while the Times headline reads Sunak hit by resignations and the biggest rebellion yet. The Metro carries a pledge from the European boss of the tech firm Fujitsu to compensate sub-postmasters who were wrongfully convicted as a result of its faulty Horizon computer system. The Daily Mirror also reporting on the apology from Fujitsu with the words, "About time." The Sun features a story about toddler Bronson Battersby, reporting he starved to death next to his father's body. The headline reads, "Why did authorities not save this tragic toddler?" Houston, we have a moron, says the Daily Star, reporting the Space Minster mixes up Mars with the Sun and thinks Jupiter is Saturn. It is a story I missed, but I'm intrigued to find out more, I think. Anyway, scan that QR code that you'll see on screen during the programme, and you can check out the front pages for yourself while you listen to our guests. And dominated the papers, Pippa and Sebastian, by the Rwanda revolt. Always very grateful when you rush in, having penned the lead. But anyway, Pippa, was it bigger than anticipated, do you think? And if so, what are the implications?
Well, I think there's two things about this story. This is a rebellion delayed, really, from before Christmas, when we had the second reading of the legislation, and there was a huge amount of heat and noise in Westminster, and then no Tory MPs voted against the legislation and a number abstained instead. So we all sort of waited until this moment. Number 10 and the Home Office were negotiating with Tory rebels on the right of the party, trying to get them on side. They wanted the bill toughened up. But the problem for the government was that if they toughened it up too far, then the bigger number of Tory MPs on the centre wing, the left wing of the party, the One Nation wing, would regard it as having breached international law and would vote against it. So they're balancing these two different parts of the Conservative Party. And it was always going to be explosive. But I think the key thing is that while today and tomorrow in the Commons, they've been voting, it's called committee stage, voting on a series of amendments to toughen up the bill. That's where the defeats have come. Not the defeats, the rebellions have come, crucially, because Labour voted against the rebellions. The government ended up, the bill remains unamended. And if the bill remains unamended tomorrow as well, as we expect it to, then we have what's called third reading, which is the last Commons hurdle before the bill then goes on to the House of Lords. And that is a different matter. If you speak to some of the Tory rebels today on the right, they suggest that actually they could rebel for third reading, that they are very opposed to the bill because they don't think it will work, rather than the principle of sending people to Rwanda. But only a very small number have actually gone on the record. We're talking about a dozen, maybe a few more. And it would need 29 rebels to vote down,
reminding myself,
to vote against the bill for it to fall. And it's also broader than just the bit of legislation. It actually is potentially existential for the government. If this flagship bit of legislation falls, it's a huge problem for Rishi Sunak. Does it mean another leadership contest or leadership crisis anyway? What does that mean for them? And I think there's a big difference between MPs being prepared, those 60 MPs being prepared to vote for those amendments to toughen up the bill, but then having failed to do that, then going on and bringing down the whole legislation.
Yeah. So, Sebastian, they have their protest, but then they don't want to wobble the foundations to rock either the Prime Minister or, indeed, the prospect of having a general election, because that could follow too, couldn't it, if this bill gets thrown out?
Well, this all comes down to that number, the 29 number. And when this bill went for its second reading, as you said, a lot of people held back their fire. They expressed concerns on TV cameras and Twitter and that sort of thing, but decided ultimately to get behind the bill at that stage. The question now, as we've seen these people showing their concerns about the bill, Are they going to pull the whole house of cards down by actually voting against it? And I think, as Pippa has just highlighted, voting against it would be a pretty drastic thing to do at this stage, because it's a massive piece of legislation. It's one of Rishi Sunak's key pledges. And so I think those Conservative rebels will be thinking pretty hard tonight about where they're going to go. And the question this comes down to is the enemy being the enemy of the good in this situation. We saw there's an awful lot during the Brexit wars back when I was a journalist, and you were there as well, Pippa. We lived through those endless votes on where Brexit was going and how it looked. And there were lots of people who took an absolutist approach. They wanted their form of Brexit and absolutely nothing else, and were happy to vote against it. And that's how we ended up with Theresa May being pulled down. And on this situation, the fact is, if this bill doesn't pass the third reading tomorrow, that's it. There's no real alternative to this legislation at this point. It is overwhelmingly unlikely. I can't see really what other bill would come back if it's going to be tough or whatever. So at that stage, everything goes into limbo. So the stakes are pretty high going into tomorrow. And I imagine the Prime Minister's team and ministers will be hitting the phones tonight, trying to say to people, look, we understand your concerns. We're going to do everything we can to toughen up this bill. And that's the other thing to watch about what happens between now and the vote. Is there any movement from the government? Can they assuage any of the concerns before it comes to that crunch moment?
We're talking about extra 158 judges today to speed up any appeals, but that still makes you realise that the government expects appeals, which is the bit that the rebels are worried about. It's all comes stalling down again because of the appeals process.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things that the government is suggesting, neither of which actually fundamentally alter the legislation. One is 150 extra judges. Though really, interestingly, the Lady Chief Justice Sue Carr said today, she's a senior judge in England, she came out and she criticised the plan, suggesting that it has to be for the judiciary to make decisions about how judges were deployed, and that the government shouldn't be getting involved in areas that were their responsibility. Plus, also, I think, frankly, if the government does decide or does try to move 150 judges over to look at these cases, it begs the question. I mean, you look at the court's backlog at the moment. I mean, some rape cases are taking 5 years to get to trial because of the court's backlog, and there's all sorts of other cases as well. It's a serious problem and I think underlines, for a Prime Minister that presumably wants to be seen as tough on law and order and dealing with the court's backlog, if he shows that his priority is a scheme which lots of people think might not end up actually happening, the Rwanda scheme, then, they may question his priorities in that as well.
So taking a step back, because you mentioned the Brexit votes, many a cold night was spent at Westminster for many of us then. It was hard to see the wood for the trees about the detail at that point. So if we take a step back, why is Rwanda so important? Who's told them they need a deterrent? Is it playing well in the focus groups? Why die on this hill is the question, I suppose.
So this obviously comes back to a fundamental thing with Brexit, which was about control of borders and immigration. That was a clear thing behind the 2016 vote to leave the EU, but then also the 2017 election, the 2019 election, and the 2010 and the 2015 elections. So pretty much every time you've gone to the British people, they've always said they want control of borders, they want to reduce migration. And the big increase in the small boats crossing the English Channel of asylum seekers has created a lot of concern, because obviously the numbers have been particularly high in recent years, but also because it's got to that kind of core sense, does the government have control of the borders? Are people getting what they wanted within the Brexit vote? And people are probably feeling no is the answer. And my think tank Onward did some polling on this, which I'm going to mention just casually here, which shows that 88% of constituencies in this country, 9 out of 10, want control and reduction. And that we asked people what they think the level of net migration is, and the average answer was about 70,000. Last year, it was 670,000. So the perception between where things are and what people think they are is wildly out of kilter. So that brings us to why we're talking about this Rwanda scheme. So this is a scheme that would see...
Well, yeah, you say that, but they can't shout out about how fantastic their legal migration figures are. So this is a brilliant distraction from that, isn't it? Because this is about
part of the same thing. I wouldn't say it's a
migration.
distraction. I'd say it's part of the same conversation. I wouldn't say it's one or the other. They're both part of
the
it.
proportion of this, stop the boats, is tiny compared to the legal migration that we're seeing.
Absolutely, but it still speaks to people, that sense of control. When you break down all types of migration, people feel very strongly they want to or reduced, but that is much more so for illegal migration. So the Rwanda scheme is all about a deterrent to try and stop those small boats from crossing. It's faced numerous legal challenges. We have a bill in front of Parliament which is trying to overrule Supreme Court ruling that said Rwanda is not safe, and it's helpfully called the Safety of Rwanda Bill.
Yeah.
This has become a flashpoint for this issue. Is that a good enough summary? Have I missed anything out?
Before you pick out, we're just getting more papers in. There's the Times then. Sunak hit by resignations and the biggest rebellion yet. Deputy Chairman quit on the eve of key Rwanda vote. We'll come to the significance of that in a minute. The Eye is in, got the Telegraph as well, so let's just see that. It's got the number 60 Tories turn on the Prime Minister in the Rwanda rebellion, and the Eye is just in too, so let's might as well take a look at that as well. We're here. Top Tories quit in protest as Sunak sees off the Rwanda rebels. Sees off for now. That's the point, isn't it, I suppose, until tomorrow. You were going to pick up on what Sebastian was saying, though, I think, Pippa.
Well, I think it's just the key point about the difference between legal and illegal migration, and the fact that while it is true, of course, that lots of people feel very strongly about both of those, they feel more strongly about the big issue of the economy. And I think what has happened is that Rishi Sunak has decided that this is going to be his flagship. This is going to be his moment. I mean, there were moments when he inherited this policy from Boris Johnson and the Liz Truss. He could have said early on, actually, you know what, this isn't going to work. It's going to be too complicated. Let's come up with another scheme. And he didn't. He stuck with it. And it seems to be at a point now where it's like sucking energy out of the government and out of the Conservative Party and not really leaving the bandwidth for them to deal with the biggest issue that people are concerned about, which is the cost of living. Now, their hope, presumably, will be that this all gets resolved and they get the first flight off to Rwanda, and that's very symbolic, before an election. But the odds are 50-50 of that happening, even with an election later this year. The legal advice suggests that. It's got to go through the House of Lords, it's got to go through the courts process because of these individual appeals, as we've said. You know, there's going to be lots of battles ahead on this. And instead, what you end up seeing, once again, is a divided Conservative Party. You know, it's not just the two wings of the Conservative Party, even the right is divided between those that want to hammer Rishi Sunak, and it's all about causing him damage, and those
because
that actually
have Boris Johnson.
Because he brought down Boris Johnson. And then the slightly larger group that actually have some principled objections to this particular legislation. It's a bad look for the Tory party, for a country that already looks at them and thinks they're more interested in themselves and what's going on internally in the party than they are in addressing the issues.
So the mood music in Downing Street tonight, you know, you've lost your two chairmen out of a number. You know, you've had some of the
Quite a large number.
Quite a large number. I was told 11 last night. Is it 11? Anyway, there's a lot of deputy chairs of the Conservative Party and vices. Anyway, there's lots of them, so do you miss two? But also the names who you've decided to vote with these amendments, you know, Liz Truss, you know, Jacob Rees-Mogg, you know, some of the people you'd expect. In Downing Street, you sitting there worrying? Are you on the phones? How do you handle it?
I think certainly on the phones. I think because obviously it is a massive vote, as we said, tomorrow, because it will be a crunch day and trying to convert that 60-odd number down to, well, below 29, essentially, making sure that those who voted for the amendments don't go into people who are voting against the legislation. I think, but as I said earlier, I think the question really is going to be, it is a very different order of magnitude to vote down the whole bill than vote for an amendment to try and toughen it up. And the argument is really going to be about the fact that this legislation is tough. There's no doubt about it. I mean, if you look at all the bills that have gone through Parliament over the last 10 years on immigration, this is pretty tough. It doesn't go as far as some of the rebels. It's probably never going to go as far as some of the rebels want to, even if, you know, because as I said, there is a sense that, a bit like Brexit, it's become a loyalty test in a way and has gone beyond the actual purpose, what you're talking about here. And that's obviously always a danger in politics. But as Pippa said, there are many other things going on in the country at the moment. And even in the migration debate, Rwanda is just one part of it as well. So I think everyone would like to sort of get this done, get some flights off, and then go talk about other things. And for the Labour Party, of course, they want to just highlight that they don't think Rwanda is going to work.
OK, and the Express, finally, as well, I mean, you talked about your polling shows how critical it is for members of the public, this, but most people don't follow it in great detail. The end result is they just see a divided party, and as they were told this week, divided parties don't win elections. So there you go. PM's last-ditch plea to rebels come together on the Rwanda plan. So, you know, he's desperate to get it, you know, passed and through and move on, isn't he, I suppose? But hits the laws, of course, after that, Pippa. Just a final quick thought.
Hits the Lords, hits the courts. Looks, you know, raises questions about his judgment about using this as his flagship policy. You know, it's a big gamble for him having stuck with it. Currently, it doesn't look particularly like it's one that's going to pay off.
Takes us through to the summer, doesn't it, really? But anyway, here we go. It's only January. Coming up, the European boss of the technology firm at the centre of the post office scandal apologises, discussing that in more detail. are watching the press preview, joined once again by Pippa Crerar and Sebastian Payne. Welcome back to both of you. Big day for post office evidence today as well. Fujitsu's Europe boss and the head of the post office. And Pippa, some fascinating testimony, an apology, a willingness to understand. He actually started to say the word culp and then said responsibility as well. The idea that they would compensate or share the responsibility to compensate victims. But what did you make of what we heard?
It's very striking. It was Paul Patterson, who's the European boss of Fujitsu, which obviously provided the software to the post office during the Horizon software that is at the heart of the post office scandal. And what was so striking about it is that up until this point, obviously we've had years of obfuscation. In fact, not even that, not even sort of an acknowledgement that anything was wrong. And the reason that these postmasters were prosecuted was because the post office and Fujitsu refused to accept that anything was wrong with the software. And then we've got to the point where eventually, because of the campaigning action and the High Court rulings, they had to accept that something was wrong, and they called an inquiry, a public inquiry, which is currently hearing all the evidence and trying to get to the bottom of who knew what and when. But even now, with that inquiry ongoing, in fact, because the inquiry is ongoing, you have answers from the post office saying, well, look, obviously, we want all of this information to be out there. We're sorry about the fact that people have had a really difficult time, but, you know, we need to let the inquiry do its work. And so this is why this is surprising, because Fujitsu, up until this point, have been completely silent. Even after the ITV documentary, the ITV drama rather, kind of exploded this all and there's been sort of real public and media attention on it. So it was quite surprising to see Paul Patterson come forward and admit that they were involved from the very start,
and that they had
did
bugs
have
from the very
errors
start
in the system from the very start, and that they were aware of it, and that they did help the post office in their prosecutions of the postmasters, and saying that he's truly sorry. And I kind of think it was the right thing to have done, obviously. I mean, lots of questions about timing and why now.
Yes.
But even so, you know, that it was surprising. It probably was the right thing for them to do. And crucially, it's not just about words. He also indicated, as the government has suggested, that Fujitsu should pay its share of compensation, a bill which is probably likely to be over £1 billion. The company, over the 25-year contract, I think, has been paid about £2.5 billion. Presumably there's some profit in there. But the fact that he suggested that the company would be willing to contribute, it shouldn't just be the taxpayer.
I know you're desperate to talk about this, but I want to do Trump. So just if you've got something to say on this, just very, very quickly.
I'll wait for Trump.
OK, go for it.
We'll come back to this at the next
OK, right, OK, fine. Anyway, Trump. He did it big. A number of candidates have dropped out. You know, only 3 remaining. Do they drop out quickly? Is it all going to be done and dusted quite fast? What do you think?
Well, this is what the former US president has been trying to say when he's been calling people to come together. That headline once again. We've seen everywhere. And I mean, his level of victory in Iowa in the caucus is really quite astounding. 98 out of 99 caucuses all voted for President Trump. And he claimed before it was going to be the biggest, the most beautiful win you've ever seen. And that's sort of, I guess, what happened in that case. And you saw Vivek Ramaswamy dropped out, who was an insurgent, had quite a lot of attention. But the 2 other people running in the race, Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, they're both in kind of almost joint second place, and they've got similar amounts of votes, but they are so far behind Donald Trump. Now, the next thing will be...
You add their votes together, you know, you start to get into the 40s.
Potentially, but of course, obviously, things are never that straightforward as what would happen. I think the next thing to look at is New Hampshire and to see, does Ron DeSantis gain momentum? If not, it could end rather quickly. OK, New Hampshire next week, full coverage of that. Thank you, Pippa, Sebastian. We'll see you next hour. To the weather now.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, the next few days will stay cold with snow and ice for some, but the weekend will bring mild, wet and windy weather. Wednesday then, starting with a sharp frost and icy stretches. Cloudiest south will be less cold. Lowest temperatures will be where there's lying snow, with minus 15 degrees Celsius possible somewhere in Scotland. Freezing fog patches too.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, coming up next on Sky News at 11, 2 Deputy Tory chairmen were among the resignations from government in a rebellion over its Rwanda bill. Our news review and press preview coming up next.